Good afternoon, everyone. The time is upon us, so we'll get started. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the Antipode lecture and to introduce Professor Lynn Staeheli, who will be delivering the Antipode lecture. Lynn specifically urged me to keep this brief. So I will keep it brief. Most of you need no introduction to Lynn's work. She's been working on a wide range of issues and has left her imprint in a variety of subfields in political geography, feminist geography, democracy and citizenship, education, and migrant activism. She is currently professor in the Department of Geography at University of Durham, and from 2006 to 2010 she was Ogilvy Chair and Professor in the Department of Geosciences at University of Edinburgh. She's the author of a book, The People's Property, with Don Mitchell most recently, and the author of over 40 refereed articles, and I really sort of lost track of the number of commentaries and chapters that she has in addition to that. So it really sort of put me a little bit to shame. But regardless, it's a pleasure to introduce Lynn. She will be speaking for roughly 35 to 40 minutes, and then we will have space for a discussion. Whose responsibility is it, is the title of Lynn's talk. Welcome, Lynn. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure, sort of, to be here. I always get nervous giving a talk like this, and when Wendy asked me whether I would do it, I thought, I'm not really the typical Antipode lecture person. I mean, of all of the things that describe me, I think probably chief among them are middle-aged, middle class, and housewife. And I decided then to give a talk on whose responsibility is it, so I can nag just like I do my. But then when I was putting together the talk, I had this real moment of panic, because the typical thing that you do when you write is you have a title page, says the title, and then your name. So whose responsibility is it? Lynn A. Staeheli. Well, I'm not doing that. Instead, I'm going to start with a story about a fellow named Chris Mitchell, who I met in the summer of 2010 at a drop-in center for homeless people in Boulder. Now, Chris describes himself as a street caseworker, and he volunteers at a number of organizations that provide services for people without homes. And he's started other organizations, including FEED, which is Friends Encourage Eating Daily. Now, he describes his work as hanging out with homeless people. He checks on them, listens to them, and he's generally a kind person to them. He's formerly homeless himself, and his own housing situation is far from stable. He's also the manager of an overflow shelter for homeless people that opens in the basements of local churches when the temperature is predicted to drop below freezing at night. Now, the shelter accepts almost anyone, including people to whom the main homeless shelter has refused entry. And he says he just looks at, they come in and he says, "Are you going to give me trouble?" And they say, "No, sir." And he lets them come in. Now, he says about 5 years previously, God called him to leave his home and his family and to find people who needed him. And God led him to Boulder, which is an interesting concept. But for all of that, God doesn't feature prominently in his talk, but responsibility does. He talks about our collective responsibility to take care of each other, to share, and to be kind. He's very skeptical of government programs to assist poor people, and he dismisses the government as not being in it for the right reasons. They don't have the right values. Now, over the past 20 years, it turns out I've interviewed a lot of people like Chris, although I haven't quite realized it. Their stories are always moving and inspiring, and while the particulars vary, there's a common thread in the way that they talk about obligation and about commitment to people who struggle, who are marginalized, and who've been punished and discarded by society. And in ways that often surprise me, many of these activists use the language of responsibility and community with what I think is almost a reckless abandon. The terms run through their descriptions of what they do, why they do it, and their vision for the kinds of societies and social relationships they hope to build in the future. Yet his comments that summer gave me pause in a way that similar stories had not. And I think the reason is that 2 months before, a new government had been formed in Britain, promising and then introducing a suite of legislation intended to promote values of freedom, fairness, and responsibility. This slogan was intended to encapsulate the meaning of citizenship in a renewed Britain, characterized by a big society and a dramatic retrenchment of the state. It's a story we've also heard before in the United States, with its echoes of the contract with America and the retrenchment of social welfare provision here in the 1990s. Now, in both of these governmental moves, as well as in the normative arguments put forward by many activists, communities and individuals are argued to hold a responsibility toward other people. This responsibility leads citizens and community members to be attuned to the welfare of others and to act accordingly. Now, scholars have talked about this in terms of the responsibilization of citizenship. And while Chris fully embraces the idea and even the imperative of responsibility, he rejects the argument that the state is acting on the same normative values that he holds. The state is not in it for the right reasons and does not have the right values, he argues. So in this paper, what I want to do is examine the congruence and the disjunctions between state and activist discourses of responsibility. And I'll begin with a brief consideration of the notions of obligation and responsibility in citizenship, but then try to move quickly to the way that these ideas are animated in state policy and in the work of activists. And I'm going to draw on interviews that I've conducted at two critical moments, it seems to me, of retrenchment of state social welfare provision in the US in order to understand how these activists describe the responsibilities of citizenship, community, and the state with regard to welfare provision. Now, there's a lot of overlap then in the language that activists and the state use, but the normative values that underpin the language diverge. And that divergence is important as it leads many activists to a political stance in opposition to the state and in opposition to programs of retrenchment. Now, I'm not going to do the long march of theory, I hope. But it's important to situate what I'm talking about in the context of theories of liberal democracy and of liberal citizenship. Because citizenship is often described as involving a bundle of rights that are available to all members of the political community. And so in the context of globalization and of retrenchment of social welfare provision, attention is directed to the implications of democracy of what appears to be a diminution of the social rights of citizenship. Now, less frequently mentioned, except perhaps by political philosophers, are the obligations that are attached to citizenship. These are the obligations attached to citizenship. They take many forms, but typically they rattle off things like taxation, military service, jury duty, and so forth. Now, the invocation of these mundane aspects of obligation, which often, it seems to me, involve the rote performance of routine required deeds, these aspects mask what I think are the moral and normative aspects of obligation, or the bonds that compel citizens to act in particular ways and from which they cannot exit. Now, Michael Brown has persuasively argued that attention to obligation is necessary for a balanced understanding of citizenship and of the public moralities that underlie it. Now, there are two issues here that I wish to highlight. Now, first of all, it may seem more than a little strange to say that obligation has not received much attention because responsibility talk does seem pervasive. But these two terms, obligation and responsibility, seem to be used interchangeably in public discourse and even in political philosophy. But it's important to draw a distinction between them. Obligation implies a bond and even a duty that cannot be abrogated. The Oxford Dictionary, my favorite source since moving to Britain, so I can understand what people are talking about, the dictionary defines obligation in terms of responsibility, but also as a burden, a compulsion, an onus, and a liability. Obligation can be put on a person by virtue of membership with or without consent. Responsibility, however, does not carry those kinds of connotations, with the dictionary using terms such as task, function, job, and so forth, dependability. It also lists authority, control, and power, but the notion of compulsion, of a bond, is missing in the definition of responsibility. More than a matter of semantics, it seems to me this is important because responsibility then carries the possibility of voluntarism and consent that is not necessarily part of obligation. Carol Pateman, Nancy Hirschman, and other feminist philosophers have noticed the significance of this. They argue that the liberal democratic state is built on an assumption of voluntarist consent on the part of citizens to give up some of their freedoms to be governed. Whether one thinks about this in terms of a social contract or a more utilitarian notion based on trading some rights to maximize individual well-being, the point is that liberal theory and liberal democratic citizenship assumes that citizens consent, and in consenting, voluntarily agree to their responsibilities. Now, I'll argue later that the voluntarism and consent here can be used to justify the diminution of rights in certain circumstances. But Nancy Hirschman argues that such voluntarism is in reality a camouflage for coercion. And the camouflage is provided by arguments about the responsibilities of citizenship and whether individuals are meeting them. Now, second, so that's the first point. The second point is that while debates over voluntarism and consent have claimed theoreticians' attention, the moral values and norms carried in obligation often seem to be overlooked. And it seems to me there's a kind of shyness when we talk about norms and values in the academy. And perhaps because talking about morals comes perilously close to moralizing. And so now my status as the mother of 2 teenage boys comes into effect. But moralizing is different to the task of analyzing the norms that underpin citizenship in a given context, or of analyzing other people's norms, particularly when we want to take those people seriously without necessarily agreeing with them. Yet I'll argue that this is exactly what we need to do in the context of citizenship. Now, it seems to me what's particularly important for the rest of this paper then is the possibility of competing norms and competing values of obligation. This is why we need to pay attention to what underlies what people are talking about, not just to follow the words, but to follow the meanings. Now, one set of norms relies on the relationship between voluntarism and responsibility. As I indicated, if liberal theory and democracy are predicated on an idea of consent by autonomous individuals, then it follows that citizens must assume some responsibilities as detailed or as set out by democratic governance. Once decisions are made through a democratic process, it's argued, citizens have a normative responsibility to act in accordance with them. If, however, one moves away from the voluntarist position, other sources of obligation and other values may assume greater importance. Many feminist philosophers, for example, challenge the notion of the self in liberal theory, and instead locate individuals in webs of social relationships. Obligation, then, they argue, emerges through connection rather than the voluntary consent of autonomous subjects. From this stance, it's possible to imagine norms of care and mutuality as the basis of obligation. When states, a crucial set of institutions that are entwined in relationships of political obligation, fail to act on those norms of care and mutuality, one could expect to see oppositional politics and mobilizations justified on the grounds that the state is failing to meet its obligations. And these are obligations that are not rooted in the notions of consent or even in emotions and feelings of compassion, but rather in bonds of compulsion that the state is not morally justified in ignoring. Now, oppositional politics in this way are not simply about specific policies, but they're about fundamental issues of obligation, about its source and about its moral bases. And it raises the question then of whose responsibility it is to care and what care entails. Now, make no mistake about this. Care and mutuality and connection does not lead to a comfortable politics or to a so-called post-political stance. Those questions of responsibility, whose it is and its nature, are not resolved by moral commitment. Rather, commitments to care and connection embed the same agonisms regarding responsibility and obligation, as do other political stances and other political fights. But a broader attention to obligation, its moral bases, and its sources helps us trace the different meanings of responsibility as it's deployed in political debate and social activism. Now, a great deal has been written about responsibilization in the context of welfare and citizenship by neoliberal regimes, and I'm not going to rehearse it here. Instead, I want to summarize a couple of changes this literature critiques that are important to social service provision and activists, and these activists are the real focus of this paper. Now, welfare restructuring in Europe and North America has generally been described as involving a greater role for regional and local governments in the design of services and a greater role for voluntary nonprofit organizations and communities and civil society. With these moves from the state to the civil society and communities, states shift the nominal responsibility for the social welfare of citizens from the state to individuals. The 1996 welfare bill in the United States, for instance, carries the formal title Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. Responsibility for well-being is thus personal, not the US government's, and it's certainly not a social right. Rather than the direct provision of services, then, the state plays an increasingly pedagogical role in attempting to change behaviors. And as Jones, Pikett, and Whitehead argue, this is the defining characteristic of economic, cultural, and political power. That term power is really important, as the other characteristic of governance of welfare putatively is the shift of responsibility. But in fact, authority and power are not shifted from state to institutions and individuals. In terms of the definitions of responsibility here, then, it's at best a partial shift. Now, some portion of the rationale for this change comes from the economist James Buchanan and his analysis of the Samaritans Dilemma. Buchanan, the term comes from the parable of the Good Samaritan in the New Testament of the Christian Bible, wherein a stranger goes out of his way to help a person in need. Buchanan argues that while this was a laudable act of altruism and of charity, we can easily go too far and help people into dependency. Now, this idea is picked up and furthered by people such as Ronald Reagan in his frequent invocation of the welfare queen, and even by people like Bill Clinton, who drew on this argument in his notion of the arguments that welfare should be a hand up, not a handout. Localities and communities, they both argued, were best positioned to provide that hand up such that people could meet their responsibilities. Now, this valorization of the local and civil society continues in political debates today. It's evidenced, for instance, in David Cameron's justification, the British Prime Minister's justification, for his plans to replace the welfare state with a flourishing big society. And he argues here that in the past, before the state helped people too much, there was an ethos of self-improvement, of mutuality and responsibility. But as the state continued to expand, it took away from people more and more things they could be doing for themselves. Human kindness, generosity, and imagination were squeezed out by the work of the state. Now, Cameron makes an empirical argument, but it's a moral normative argument about the appropriate role of the state vis-a-vis civil society and individuals. It's an argument that posits that the state has inappropriately supplanted the ethos of altruism that had existed in Britain to the detriment of everyone. Now, this is an argument that sounds an awful lot like people that I've been interviewing make. And so one woman a volunteer at a church in Denver that provided food, clothing, and housing to poor people argued, we could ask more from government. We could ask more for government. We could ask them to make more taxes so that they could set up shelters and so forth. But we could enlarge the welfare system. But we would then be taking individuals with good hearts out of the picture, and we would just enlarge the government. And she argues further that we're here to feed the people, to feed God's people, and to clothe them and house them. Now, those arguments about who bears responsibility for helping others is important. Yet it's also important to recognize that they are moral arguments that are poorly represented in much of the academic literature, at least as regards the responsibilization of citizens. As important as that literature is, It often fails to account for the ways that many community organizations and activists want to assume more responsibility, believing that the state is in fact too far removed and is in fact unresponsive. And we can point to the welfare rights movements in the United States of the late 1960s and 1970s, which were provoked in part by the belief that bureaucrats were interfering and disciplining without listening to the claims of poor citizens or responding to legitimate demands. Those movements worked very hard to vest responsibility in community organizations and organizations of poor people as a means of empowering them. So the point I want to highlight here is that responsibility talk is not the exclusive preserve of conservatives or of governments wishing to divest themselves of responsibility for the welfare of its citizens. Instead, it's to highlight the convergence of discourses of responsibility, but only as a first step in demonstrating the divergence. And it's in the mix of convergence and divergence that the politics of responsibility can be seen. Now, I'm going to talk about a couple of methods here, too. This paper, I've been interviewing people then about responsibility for about 20 years, even though I didn't realize it. In the interviews with community activists and service providers I've been conducting, I asked about issues facing their city, quality of life, the kinds of things they thought were important to improve them, and so forth. I also asked them why they got involved in activism or service provision. And I asked them about their definitions of politics and their definitions of citizenship. In asking those questions, none of which mentioned responsibility, people told me stories of responsibility and obligation. Now, the interviews that I'm going to draw on are from two separate research projects, and this probably also is not a good idea. But the first was directly on service provision and activism in the context of the mid-1990s with the looming changes associated with the contract with America, the imposition of reforms or of new welfare legislation associated with the new Republican majority in the Congress. For this project, 61 interviews were conducted by Susan Clark, a colleague of mine in political science at Colorado, Christina Paikonen, and myself, in 1994. And it was in the cities of Tacoma and Spokane, Washington, and Colorado Springs, Colorado. Now, the second project is ongoing, and it's with Don Mitchell and Kafuiato. And this is about public life, and so far includes about 55 interviews with people involved in housing provision, policing, food programs for the poor, and community activism in the Denver region and the East Bay region of San Francisco, East Bay region, generally Berkeley and Oakland. So the projects are different, but there are similar questions asked in both of the projects. And what I've done is go through the transcripts of these interviews and searched out to see how they talked about responsibility. And as a first step, it was just searching on the word responsibility and analyzing the text then for the ways they talked about it. Now, as it happens, a lot of people didn't talk about responsibility at all, and so I didn't consider them further. And I'm going to argue that makes for a much more conservative, more cautious kind of analysis than if I had tried to interpret what they meant by responsibility, when they used a synonym, or what I considered to be a synonym. Now, I kept track of all of the definitions they used, as well as whether they were critiquing the definition or not. I also examined the interviews to consider the kind of political agenda they promoted. And in particular, I was interested in those respondents and organizations that were involved in what I'll call oppositional politics. Now, this sample, to the extent that one wants to call it a sample, may seem unusual, and it may not be a good idea to combine them. But my interest was in the ways that activists at two moments of debate over social welfare and social welfare provision talk about these issues and about their motivations. And it turns out there are a few differences in the two sets of interviews. I really expected there would be stronger differences. Instead, what emerges is an enduring oppositional politics, small, limited cell and possibilities here. Some on it generally, some of them, a significant portion of those response from large voluntary and civil organizations with chapters in multiple cities and to some extent through national level networks. These are organizations that might be thought of as nonprofit. these are kinds of situations. And while that's of interest, he's given the assumption of the sensitivity of these organizations to needs. What's of more interest, variety that respondents talked about responsibility. For instance, a relatively large share of the interviews in 1980s that provided definitions of responsibility in terms of accountability and self-sufficiency, saying, for instance, that individuals needed to be taught budgeting skills so they could pay the rent and be accountable for their behavior. People raising this definition really supported, and they certainly didn't support the diminution of social welfare. They instead were often to raise these issues. One woman, for example, argued that for women was important if they were to throw off the patriarchal state, the institution of marriage. Fulfillment. It sets you free. Her words may a notion of responsibilities, but this here. Film independent acting responsibly so that you don't have to this or a political institution. Now, the second set of definitions of responsibility looks at institutions acted and for respondents the residents of a neighborhood about the division of labor between nonprofit service providers with poor people. One woman, for example, in Denver, talks about statutory responsibilities for law, but also behavior follow the law, sensitive to the history of the city. And Denver is a city the police department for quite some time because a continuing string of claims of violence against racial identity in the city. And so she argues that to ignore racial dynamics, their responsibility was compounded in play. Violence, period. And particularly, people shouldn't use behind greater responsibility to protect civil liberties, a greater accountability. She's making challenging the state of accountability, responsibility, and statutory and rooted in law, also rooted in the history of the city. Now, this seems to me to be a very different kind of responsibility that's then mentioned in some of the critical civilization. Back to the leadership, to the state. It doesn't accept the downloading of responsibility. Condone violence on anyone's part. Communities, she tells us, people need to own up to them. Accepting the responsibility on the part of the police responsibility in the context of gender's past racial enough to recognize that history, the police have a responsibility to act in particular ways because of it. Not surprisingly, the included definitions of responsibility, accountability, self-sufficiency, the law, often assigned responsibility to individuals. So, for example, homeless or marginalized skills and so forth that were intended to help people attain self-sufficiency. These respondents often organizations thought of as part of the or voluntary organization state restructuring depends on the burden of reduced government funding. Few of those organizations were who took individual responsibility proactively in the government. In fact, they were generally looking for money. Chris, I opened possible exception. Teaching skills but he's in this regard, disciplining in these non and as a friend, as a discipline. One example I took on homeless. And the emergency room, cost of about $6 an episode in the city. Chris took the man under his wing. To take. Now he's interested in saving the city particular money. He's worried. He's the man. Seriously, he funny back. Of its responsibility people in the city. Now, and that's consistent with this comments, broad, well, and moral. All of this, for instance, Han ran a crisis nursery. It was a now, people in the city, including the size of the plane, it was just by day increase nursery and Saturday. This bus, the vehicles that I who was sitting said, Gary, and made the decision. And I said, state-led discourse responsibility. Communal. Those who refuse about this effort to the state to on the road making. First, donations to illegal all of the conditional of some cities was that it not be used for political purposes. But he scoffed at that and he used it to community. Now, like and so he would by virtue of the law and break was he helped, he argued, meet its it take care of what they need to serve. Turn mutual. Community response. So that not necessarily the actually people city involved puts people people in jeopardy. It's not that care will. Further, I've just an argument was either by 2010 were the basis individual responsibility the respondents and or the organization engaged in oppositional politics or another. Respondents engaged in oppositional politics. Figure you're most and most action is done by small universe of people involved. Using the term government, it is to effect radical change in social, economic, and political systems in ways that challenge humanity. And there are two of such politics amongst the responses here. Changes to the right and direct way. Time through and to be accountable. Action, commitments, and values in ways that almost shame them and citizens to the state, and they typically refuse government funds. They try different ways. And it challenged the state in individuals shed their in terms of voluntary. They about commitments and mutuality. And I apologize, like I figured this was looking pretty good. So what is this table? Kind of politics, resistance, and take it indicates there is a definition. So number one, sufficiency, and a communal responsibility. Those cells indicates when somebody quite important to me here. And a response. 10 of the 18 respondents, and it strikes me that it's to agree on anything, and so nuance ways people responsibility faceted definitions in there. They also talked about the community for well-being people. They were generally talking about intimidation, government behavior. Now, each one of these responses talked about statute or another. For example, food. We need to address abrogate responsibility. State must have to hold this. It must hold this. And powerful question of the way that it fails to obligation. are the important are the sort of that's activist breath. Family and sexuality. This was prevalent in color, racialized those either about faith in their pol work they did. Probably not prized community trace houses of sites of production values. When I asked an 85-year-old woman why she became involved in activism, she simply replied, "Why?" Son or and about faith, spirituality, and complex. So, for example, beginning that to his work. Another person was a former Catholic, but it's a particular context in spiritual sitting in the church. But it was an place where the action was seen. Of his congregation, faith and people, the of God, challenged program example, away from view. Recognize the roles that these kinds of enforcing obligations. Respond to oppositional like government, but that should. For example, explain their act. Told me you gotta go out and need. But Mom also said, powerful sense of responsibility argued. Moral values that bind together. Talk that sounds remarkably like courses of we must be too quick. Even meetings, responsibility, city, community. To now, while they use accurately, I think the arguments are voluntarily innovation goal, and they're also acting and commitment because it's also not politics framing the problem and people are widely in the U.S. and Britain. Behavior responsibly. Obligation. This of politics of reasons. Just my unease with the post-democratic systems. I understand the meaning of those terms, but also they move the they be taken out to the realm of the community. Relationship. Most of the people said it was professional, and they Mom told them to stage this politics. It was a precedent